Good evening. Thank you for coming out on this cold and wet and windy night here. Before introducing Brendan, I'd like to introduce the topic, if I may. I was struck by a quotation of Francis of about 3 lines where he spoke on Migrant Sunday in September, and I think his words are appropriate to the title of tonight's conversation. So Francis, no one must be excluded. God's plan is essentially inclusive and gives priority to those on the margins. Among them are many migrants and refugees, displaced persons, victims of trafficking. The kingdom of God is to be built with them, for without them it would not be the kingdom of God, nor the kingdom that God wants. The inclusion of those most vulnerable is the necessary condition for full citizenship in God's kingdom. The inclusion of those most vulnerable is a necessary condition for full citizenship in God's kingdom. Brendan Ryan doesn't need much of an introduction to many of you, some of you. Brendan's link over the years consistently has been in his advocating, or being, as I say nowadays, an activist for the area of the homeless, in particular with Cork Simon, and has been a voice, certainly a consistent voice, as long as I've known him, 50 years or something, not only in Cork, but beyond Cork in his work with the Shannon, and now in retirement for the Shannon, still continuing to work with those who are seeking a voice for the homeless through Cork Simon. Where each time Brendan comes here, the conversation is very stimulating and exciting. He actually on one occasion spoke so stimulating that our novices have never returned since. We never had them after Brendan's conversation. Maybe a good thing or bad thing, I don't know. So Brendan, you're very welcome again. I will be losing the congregation tonight. You're very welcome.
Thanks. I increasingly, when I arrive here, understand what imposter syndrome means, you know. I read about it, and, you know, and Stephen kind of caught me a little bit, or the decisions of the Dominican province caught me, because if I was to speak, normally it would have been at the end of March or April next year, and having to do it twice inside barely 6 months of the calendar. It meant I couldn't repeat myself as much as I'd like to, you know, because I had to think of something new. And I think a little bit glibly suggested the topic of, is the phrase that you always have the poor with you, is that it's simply a statement of a fact, or is it an excuse? But before I do that, I want to just say here, as Ursula Halligan said a fortnight ago, I am really saddened by the decision to close Ennismore. It's particularly sad for me. I started serving Mass in St. Dominic's in Athy when I was 9 years old, which is, 67 years ago. And in those days in Athy, there were 2 kinds of Catholics. There were parish Catholics and Dominican Catholics. And we were clearly a spurious breed, you know. But people rarely, the dividing line was the River Barrow, and people rarely crossed the Barrow Bridge to go to Mass. If for some reason or other we didn't make, in the famous phrase of Ireland in the past, 11 Mass, then we would reluctantly go to 12 in the parish. Not because it was much further away, but because that's the way we were. And the fact that St. Dominic's is gone grieves me. But it's more painful than that, because for reasons we won't go into here, I used to be a regular every Sunday attender at 11 Mass in St. Mary's. I have given that up, and then I'll go to my local parish church. It's a topic for another occasion as to why that might have impacted on me like that, but I know I'm not alone in that. So once Ennismore closes, my 67 years of contact with the Dominicans will be at an end, and I find that a little bit painful. Now, As regards tonight, I keep the title rather glibly, probably because Stephen was gently reminding me he needed a title for the list of conversations. But it is an interesting one, at least of interest to me, and I hope of interest to you. This may seem like the most obvious statement, but for most of the last 2,000 years it hasn't been that obvious. The Gospels are about the poor. And if you want a good, up-to-date, written by a hugely well-reputed scripture scholar, then this is a book that I would recommend. It's called Jesus, A Historical Approximation by Jose A. Pagona, a Spaniard. And what he does is he uses his enormous scholarship of how the scriptures were written to a little bit go back to create a greater sense of the social context in which Christ worked. And the more he goes through this and the more he digs, the more it is clear that his mission in Christ's eyes was to the poor and to an equally almost excluded group, to women. I have a little note here somewhere that is interesting. There are occasional references to rich people in the Gospel, not many of them, none of them very reassuring if you're rich. But there is no reference that I can recall to a rich woman anywhere in the Gospel. Now, I'm terrified here because there are at least one, if not 5 or 6, eminent scripture scholars here who may well contradict me, but I don't recall any reference to women who had riches, the references, etc. The other thing that I've always noticed about the Gospels is there's very little mention of sex in it. There is the quite understandable warning about divorce, which essentially was about protecting women, incidentally, because women were disposable in that culture. Secondly, the other one was about looking at somebody and committing adultery in your heart, which was, of course, the classic message of Christ, that it's how we are, rather than, especially more than even than what we do, that matters. And we will do what we should do, but we must do it for a good reason. If we're doing it for to be seen to be good, to be seen to be holy, or to be, but the other one, and one that I think it could have been read in Listowel a couple of weeks ago. Go and don't sin anymore, and let a person without sin throw the first stone. We don't throw stones anymore at people, but we do lots of other things to them. And I think, and that's as far as I know, the only reference to sexual relations in the entirety of the Gospels that I can remember. But maybe I conveniently, for my own conscious purposes, forgot the other references. But the Gospel is full of references to the poor and how the good news is for them. And it also, at least it seems to me, to be fairly full of references to the rich. And as I said earlier, none of them very reassuring. The 3 that I could recall not being as well read as I should be are the story of Lazarus, the story of the rich young man, and the story, the idea that, a camel could pass through the eye of an eagle easier than a rich man will enter heaven. There isn't an awful lot extended, again, harking back to recent events, there isn't much reference to hell, particularly in the Gospels either, There's a lot more about being saved. Now, you can read into it what it might mean to not be saved. But there is very little, and it only again comes up in the story of Lazarus. And I love the fact that the story of Lazarus, the version we're given gives the rich man a name, But as I recall it in the Gospel, the rich man is not even dignified with a name. He's just rich.
Yeah.
And but I always felt that was the easiest of the reference to the rich in the Gospel, because the way it was presented to me, and please don't think I'm making fun of this organisation, but if you, as Luke Kelly was once described by Ronnie Drew, he was a socialist, he gave pennies to the poor, you know. But if you were reasonably generous in how you looked after poor people, and if you were in, say, something like the St. Vincent de Paul Society, it seemed to me that that kind of would dilute the horror of what happened in that story of Lazarus and the rich man. It gets a bit more uncomfortable in the other stories. I mean, the rich young man who was clearly a good man, but he asked Christ what else should he do, and he said, "Go and sell what you have and give it to the poor and come and follow me." And he went away sorrowful. Now, I think if it is said that that poor young man was not saved, I think that's a little bit harsh. I think he probably lived a sorrowful life, knowing that he'd had an invitation he had turned down. But if we believe in God, it's a God of forgiveness. So he was probably forgiven. The hardest one of the three, and the ones that I have heard people do intellectual handstands about, is that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. I have learned more about the physical geography of Jerusalem in the process of having the eye of a needle explained to me that it wasn't really literally the eye of a literal needle. It was a difficult.
Very narrow gauge road.
Yeah. Well, so we were told anyway. I have always loved the way of when something really uncomfortable comes up, we find a way out of it, provided it's not to do with sex. You know, I'm fascinated by that. But you know, but they're all in the context of of gospels that were about the poor, and this is the point I want to make. The early church was poor and powerless, and persecuted. It was also, incidentally, and I'm not totally uninformed, I read a bit about it, it was also essentially pacifist. It did not participate, Christians did not participate in wars until what I mentioned it 2 weeks ago, what Dante described as the great catastrophe happened, and Constantine made Christianity the official religion. And I said before, we've spent 1,500 years escaping from that, you know, and maybe we are now at last escaping from it. But the other, and this is again where I have a huge issue with another great figure of early Christianity, and that of course is Augustine. The idea that because there were so many wars going on, and because I presume a lot of them were about things that Augustine thought were important, we got the concept of a just war. Now, I'm not a complete pacifist, and I would be quite conflicted about what the people of Ukraine should do. But it's one of the rare occasions in which there is it. But what I discovered, because I heard about the just war a long time ago, I tried to work out who it was that was described, who decided whether the conditions for a just war were met. And I learned early on that it wasn't the individual conscience of a misfortunate young man, because it was mostly men in those days who was being told he had to fight, nor was it a bishop. It was lawful authority. So in one fell swoop, apparently, the responsibility to decide whether a war was just was transferred from human conscience to the lawful authority. And in many cases, the lawful authority might have only been marginally, if not a Christian at all. So there I saw, this is what troubles me. Now, as I said, the early Christians were poor, pacifist, and as somebody reminded us a fortnight ago, joyful, and they were. But as the institution grew, and I believe tainted by its being the established religion, all sorts of things. And I'm not going to go through, I promise you, I'm not going to go through 1,500 years. I promise I'll do a big jump in a second. But just, what the gospel was about the poor. It was also, the author of this book says, a lot about women. And my feminist friends wouldn't be too pleased with me, but he would argue that the position of women as presented in the Gospels was extraordinarily advanced in the context of the time. That the role he gave to women, the central role that women had in discovering or finding Christ's resurrection, and lots of other things like that, and the central role of Mary in them. But when I began to look then at the church in my adult life, I didn't hear much about the poor in my first 25 years of growing up, or until I joined the Divine Word Missionaries for a couple of years, where I mentioned last week my novice master, Brendan O'Reilly, fairly well identified with us that we were there to be at the service of the poor. That was quite clear, and he was the most unauthoritarian of figures, very deeply prayerful man, and a very gentle authority figure. Quite a contrast, I understand, from other people to many novice masters at the time. But Brendan was but he explained to us about that. He also said something that, I won't say I practiced it. He said that the only justification for celibacy was supernatural. He said he could never envisage a rational, human-based belief in celibacy or in consecrated virginity. I'm afraid the distinction between them got lost to me a while back. But he was quite adamant about that. And I had those things in my mind. I have them in my mind. And then at the time, I remembered, I was only 10. I was serving Mass, so I was at a men's retreat with my father, and a good redemptorist or passionist, I'm sure, burnt our ears off about the awful thing called birth control. Now, I didn't know what birth control was. I was only 10 in 1956, I barely knew what sex was, not to mention birth control. But I probably had a little bit of sensitivity because our bishop at the time was John Charles McQuaid, and we used to get these pastoral letters, particularly around Lent. And John Charles, I wasn't old enough or informed enough to realise, to make any judgment about the content of these letters. I was an altar boy sitting on the steps in St. Dominic's in Athy, probably bored and probably thinking of something entirely different. But one thing struck me, was every one of those letters ended up with, "I remain, very reverend and dear Father, your servant in Christ." And the thing that struck my innocent 11-year-old ears was, he's not our servant, he's the boss, And what all this leads up to in a meandering sort of a way is that I was beginning to live with a model of how Christians should live. And thanks to Brendan O'Reilly, I was aware of what the Gospel said. And it suddenly dawned on me that in lots of ways, our church was a church of compromise. For a church that swore there were no compromises with the sins of the flesh at all. I mean, I still remember the first time I read what was regarded as a mainstream book, which essentially said that all sins involving sex were probably sufficiently grievous to be mortal sins. I was never pursued that very far, but the church, it looked to me, compromised. And that's why somebody like Francis of Assisi is such an astonishingly noticed person, because he noticed, but he didn't manage to make, and Luther noticed, but Luther didn't manage, and Erasmus noticed. I mean, I don't know much, some of the people here know far more about Erasmus than I do, but Erasmus was as good a critic of the church as anybody else, and didn't get very far. But what I began to see more and more was a church that was essentially about power, but called it service. Was extremely wealthy, had compromised with the whole idea of war, even in the face of what it said was the unequivocal commandment that thou shalt not kill, but managed to apply that in one circumstance with absolute certainty, and managed to dilute it in an entirely other. I went searching one time to see where or if the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ever condemned as for what they were. They were war crimes, and they were acts of terrorism. Harry Truman told the American people that Hiroshima was an attack on military installations in which every step was taken to minimize civilian casualties. How many times have we heard that since from various people, So it seemed astonishing that, I remember the late Bishop Murphy saying this to me, that when he began to reflect on all of the services that the church was, or that religious orders were now involved in, he said they were set up for one reason, but they had all drifted in the same direction. The Bon Secours Hospital and the Bon Secours Order was set up to provide health care for the poor. And the Christian Brothers were set up to provide education for the poor. But as they withdraw, you will notice the schools that remain within their province, and this would probably be sadly true of the Dominicans as well, are the fee-paying schools. Not the schools of the poor, but the schools of the poor were let go. So you were watching this all the time. Now, so what looked to me was that somewhere along the way, the poor had become something different. They were there, and of course, all the appropriate things were said about looking after the poor, and there were sendings in the Paul Society, collections outside the church, and all of this is very good. I don't appear for 1 second to be making little of any of that. I'm involved in a voluntary organisation, and I know what the St. Vincent de Paul Society does, and I know how good the work is. But all of that was done in context of institutions and ways of looking at things that seem to me, looking at it now, Now, we won't bother going back over 1,500 years of history. I just want to look at the present situation, where you have a wonderful Pope speaking wonderful things, But you know for one thing that if Pope Francis says something about abortion or birth control, it will be all over the media. One of the things Pope Francis speaks most vigorously about is the arms industry. And you would really scratch around in the media to find any reference to that. And yet, the arms industry is one of the areas where even the most decent of political systems, like Sweden, for instance, they have an arms industry. And they compete. I remember in my political days going to an introduction to the European Parliament. They were trying to enlighten us a bit more about Europe. And the Vice President of the European Parliament said one of the things they were trying to do was to agree a standardised way of manufacturing weapons all through the European Union so that we can compete in the international market with the United States and Russia. You know, one of the ambitions was to become an arms exporter. Now, I mean, culturally and spiritually, it looks, you know, like we had managed. Now, and we know what the cultural arguments were, and we're not going to rehearse them, and we had them in this country, you know, the socio-sexual argument. But a huge part of the message that was in the Gospels, that is unmistakable in the Gospels. How many times has anybody in this room ever heard the story of the camel passing through the eye of the needle preached at Mass? You know?
I've heard it.
It's the rope of an eye, I heard. That I heard it explained later.
Yeah, but you know, by comparison with other things that are preached fairly regularly and that were preached fairly vociferously at one stage, you know. Now, you see, I thought, you know, some of this was understandable. You know, human institutions make mistakes, but the problem was that as this institution run by human beings was developing, it was identifying itself with a social order as it developed. And I think there's a certain irony in the way that the church essentially, Leo XIII on, spoke, I think, with sincerity about social justice, but always spoke in a context of social justice, which is said we need to tidy up the existing system. Now, Pope Francis has gone further than that, but mostly it's we need to, and part of it is, of course, that, as the Communist Manifesto says, the great houses of Europe were and that included the papacy, were watching the spectre of communism. Now, communism, I was never a communist, I was never a Marxist, and I'm not, though I believe, like many people now, that Marx was probably a better economist than he was a philosopher, because his analysis of the economy and how economies function is still very valid, and a lot of modern economists will concede that. That's without believing in his kind of millennial view of an imminent future. But the anti-communism, in many ways, and this is where I find it very painful, essentially had our church line up with a model of human nature that nearly was worse than the one that Marxists had. Because Marxism at least said we were part of a class and we were meant to work with that class in a class war to liberate working class people from the power of capital. And in the process, Marxists wanted to liberate us from God as well, I know that. But unstated for the last 200 years has been a view of human beings that is, if anything, worse than that. Because you can go back to Adam Smith, and he wasn't the worst of them, and watch the way the so-called science of economics has developed. And look at the core of that. And at the core of it is, and a lot of them nowadays kind of dilute this a bit, at the core of it is what they call rational economic man. Now, and they do say man, by the way, it's not my chosen phrase. But rational economic man is assumed to be essentially selfish. And rational economic man is assumed to be inclined always to put him or herself first. And to a degree, a particularly pessimistic Christian view of human nature played into that. Though I think it's ironic that a lot of the concepts under which this came from Scottish philosophers, all of whom were more or less atheists. But that rational economic man thing is at the core of every economic decision that is made. Why can't you raise taxes? And here's one of the great jokes. You can't raise taxes on rich people because, according to rational economic man, they'll work less. Now, there's a wonderful contradiction here, and occasionally somebody points it out. If you want to get rich people to work harder, what do? You cut their taxes. You give them more money. If you want to get poor people to work harder, what do? You reduce their income. You give them less money. Now, that's the same human being, and that comes back to the title of this rambling talk that you're getting, that at the core of it is a view that rich people and poor people are different. And I've always felt, and this is entirely my view, that the idea that of this huge, diligent, working class people all going to Mass on Sundays out of a deep sense of religious faith was only, put it mildly, partly true. Any of you who ever looked at the back of a church on a Sunday and noticed the large number of men, often with only 1 foot in the church, and gone by the time communion came, shouldn't be surprised that none of those sort of men go anywhere near a church anymore. They were only going there for reasons that were not really motivated. Now, it was probably good for them to at least address issues like that. But inside my problem is that this is where, I come up today. My problem is that the church now preaches a very, very impressive, and Pope Francis in particular, Laudato Si, and many of his pronouncements are, as you know, so controversial that some American commentators call him a Marxist, or a communist, or whatever the word they want to use. But all of them have the same thing. They say, but it's not for the church to pronounce the solution. Now this is quite peculiar because in so many other areas, the church does pronounce the solution. If you're married and you don't want to have any more children, by God, the church pronounces the solution and tells you what you cannot do, ever, and there are whole lots of areas where the church pronounces in explicit detail. I had the good fortune to escape doing Catholic moral theology, but I am reliably assured that the technical detail that Catholic moral theology manuals went into about the most extraordinarily intimate human actions if a teenager looking for some reading that might stimulate himself could get his or hands on it, they would be appropriately stimulated. I believe, I fortunately missed that. All I got in terms of that was, again, a very sane and compassionate Brendan O'Reilly explaining to us how it was going to be difficult and making sure that every one of us knew exactly what it was we were giving up. He didn't believe in it. So I was kind of wondering, and I increasingly believe is because what the church has accepted is a compromise with a way of looking at people and of looking at humanity and of looking at human nature that is essentially totally, to use a phrase again, disordered. That's the church's view is disordered, and the activities are disordered. Because the church has been persuading us, and I don't like this, that we are sinners. Look, we all do terrible things. But they're mostly terrible small things, I mean, if you think of your own life, How many times in your own lives did you do anything that you would say was really seriously wrong? You know, most people don't. Most people are good. Most people, we get cross with people, you know. But if you, most people in this room, and most people I know, if they saw 50 quid on the ground, they would go and look for who lost it. There's obviously one or two who wouldn't. And incidentally, that the fact that there's a minority who will do this is not the same as saying that everybody is like that. The great economist, and I've probably said this before here, Lord Keynes, once said that he said he had come to the conclusion that 95% of people were decent, altruistic, caring, and had a sense of their duty to other people. What I don't understand, he said, is why the other 5% are in charge of the economy. You know, that's what he said. I may have worded it slightly differently, but that's what he said, you know. And that's the fundamental thing, is that the church, by walking away from what the gospel said, on the grounds of practicality, on the grounds of we have to live in the real world, has swallowed the view of the real world, which is, and I mean, I love the way, for instance, there's huge talk now about secularization. The most secularizing thing in the world is modern liberal capitalism, without a shadow of a doubt. Communism, at least, would, of its nature, and that, I mean, I have no axe to grind on behalf of any of the countries of Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union. But remember, the Soviet Union sponsored the arts. It sponsored culture. It did it in a controlled way. But brutal capitalism will see no value in the arts. Will see no value. It's philanthropic individuals who have probably made their money in dubious kind of ways, discovered this late on in life. And I don't see philanthropy as a solution to social justice, by the way. And this, I rarely quote the Irish bishops, but they did say on their pastoral on social justice, they did say that justice or charity is what you do after justice has been established. And on that one, I do agree with them for once completely, which probably is a good reason for them to go and write something different. But at the heart, you see, we accepted, and I mean, the right-wing Catholic movement in Latin America, for instance, was a God, fatherland, and property, where the Deus Patriae Propertia, something like that. The church lined itself up, I'm not sure deliberately or accidentally, because it became obsessed with order. And it became obsessed with order because it became obsessed with structural institutions. And it was very convenient then to accept that the order that they looked at was the way the world was naturally. And you must remember, that's the basic argument that is used about the way the world is ordered economically now, that it is the natural order. If you threw everything up in the world and let it all fall down again, you would get a market economy. That's what you're supposed to believe. And sometimes it's a great idea. But remember this, if there is a natural order, and we do believe in natural law, if there is if natural law dictates that way of behaving and that way of that model of human nature, then there must be laws. And one law that we all think is true, and that, you know, if you listen to journalists, they'll say, but isn't it the law of supply and demand, you know? Now, remember, there is no absolute law of supply and demand. There is a regulated law of supply and demand. And let me give you a simple example. Suppose the ship sinks, and there are 200 people in a lifeboat, some of whom are very rich, some of whom are very poor. But there's enough food for everybody and water for everybody to live indefinitely. What happens? The law of supply and demand goes out the window, and there is a form of rationing instead it will be instituted. In most cases, I'm sure there have been exceptions where people have used force and violence to enforce a law of supply and demand. But those sort of things are human constructs. And the tragedy is the church, which should be unequivocally saying, that's not right, that's not the way to deal with poverty, that's not the way. I mean, I think it was St. Paul said if people didn't work, they shouldn't eat, and I don't disagree with that, you know. But the creating of a model which essentially left the rich largely untroubled. And they are largely untroubled, you know. I mean, I have no sign that rich people feel. One of the great myths, of course, is that the decline in religious practice in Ireland is caused by affluence. I mean, that's actually rubbish. The first people to leave and stop going to church were not the well-off. A lot of them still go happily, and they ignore what they want to ignore. It was the poor who left first. Once the element of fear began to be diluted and then dissolved, poor people, and this really should scandalise Christians, the idea that poor people would see nothing in the liturgy of the church. They would turn to a priest for all sorts of other needs. And we saw how wonderful the role of a priest was in priesthood. And we've seen it, and some of you should read a lovely piece written by Justine McCarthy in the Irish Times, because she's anything but an uncritical supporter of the church. But what she wrote was a wonderful insight into what could be and what should be. And my argument is that the problem for the church is that it has bought into a model of human behaviour which is excessively pessimistic, excessively orderly, excessively structured. And because of that, and that goes back to my topic, my theme, and now I stopped, my theme at the beginning. I mean, we have the poor. Everybody agrees we should look after the poor. You know, the rich people think, look at you, well, up to a point. You know, occasionally Irish businessmen would say that dole is too high or something. But everybody agrees we should look after the poor, everybody. But the ultimate thing is there's a belief that there is a natural order, and the belief in the natural order is based on the presumption that people are greedy, and people have and will continue to want more and more and more and more. There's overwhelming evidence that's not true. There's overwhelming evidence that people are much more nuanced than that. The famous book, The Lord of the Flies, for instance, which people love to wave around and say, look, that's what it's like. That was written by a man who had, it turns out, serious relationship problems and wasn't too fond of the rest of humanity anyway. But a group of teenage youngsters, somewhere about 20 years ago, lost at sea, ended up, a group of them, 25 or 30 of them, on a desert island, and were there for 5 or 6 months. And they did not behave in the way that Lord of the Flies would say. They organised them, these were teenagers, they organised themselves, they had a way of doing things, they had a way, if somebody misbehaved, they were dispatched to the other side of the island to be on their own for a few days, but they were never left hungry. In fact, there's a huge amount of evidence, and there's a very interesting couple of books. One is called Utopia for Realists, and the other is called, I think with a high hint of irony, Humankind, by a Dutch economist, about the evidence that people are far more willing to make sacrifices for each other, for the general group of humanity. And it's time really, in my view, and that's where I go back to this, it's time really we begin to accept that the problem is not that so-called human nature. The problem is a system of economic order that has essentially so inserted itself into our thinking that assumptions about human beings that when we think about them, we know are not true, are built into it. The British economy nearly collapsed. You remember, this is my last example, 2 weeks ago. Why? Because the markets didn't like the budget. Now, I didn't much like the budget myself any more than anybody else would, you know. But who are the markets? The markets are a few thousand people who, unlike people who have to run businesses or people who have to run shops or people who have to run bookshops, who are in the delightful position that they can make decisions to buy or sell currencies, stocks, shares, etc., without any moral inhibitions. They don't have to have ethics. They don't have to think about the environment. The phrase that has been used is that the markets operate by greed and fear. The rest of us don't. The rest of us think, and I don't mean to claim moral superiority, but the rest of us think about other people. We don't think about them as much as we should. We make mistakes, we do things, we drive too fast, put other people at risk, we do all sorts of terrible things. Well, not terrible things, we do a lot of things. But we are not completely indifferent. Whereas the people who are the markets, and there are only a few thousand of them, they operate without any of those inhibitions. And they can bring down what is about the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. Now, it's clearly insane. Clearly insane. But we as Christians, in the way that Christians have had to adjust and learn and deepen their understanding of something like evolution, or something like, like quantum physics, Christians have to address all these things. I mean, I love asking people who claim to be materialists, what is dark energy, you know? And they don't really know, because dark energy is what they use to explain a whole lot of things they can't explain. We get accused of having a God for the gaps, because of the gaps that we can't explain. But when you scratch deep into physics, there is a kind of a God of the gaps which says, we can't explain this, we can't explain that, therefore we think that. Now, if a Christian said, I can't explain this, I can't explain that, therefore I think there's a God, they'd be all yours away, you know? And I wouldn't use that argument. So what I'm saying is, we need to address the Western world intellectually. And to do that intellectually, we need to dig deep into what is assumed to be normal, natural, and which is neither normal nor natural. And when we do that, we will rediscover that the gospel is closer to the way people want to behave. It's not perfect, people are not perfect, but the gospel is closer to the way people really want to live than the commercial world we live in. Now you've had enough of me. Sorry. Thank you.
That's it. I think of that question in the light of the reports that Boris Johnson flew to Kyiv in April. I know it's thrown out, but it's not denied. Flew to Kyiv last April to scuttle talks that have the potential of ending the war.
I'm a little bit wary. I think probably inevitable. There's a little bit of a whitewashing going on about Ukraine. The war is wrong. Putin is a brute. We all know that. I mean, this is and also. But things were done in Ukraine to people who were disposed to be pro-Russian. And many political parties have been banned. Now, it's hard not to do it when you have a war and you're being invaded. I mean, the idea that there's going to be a war until Russia is defeated is nonsense. Not because the Russian army is so powerful, but because if the West, through Ukraine, was to be so successful that Ukraine was, with the West in the back, was about to invade Russia, we would then have a nuclear war. That I have no doubt that Russia would launch a nuclear war. Russia various people have tried to invade Russia and have never succeeded. They're not going to let them succeed this time. So I think everybody knows that. So I mean, ultimately there will have to be. I think the problem, and I saw hints in the papers today that the West are beginning to say to the president in Ukraine, look, there has to be a compromise here. You're winning. Now is your chance to get a decent compromise. He has to be able to say he won. I mean, it's a bit like our solution in the North. Both nationalists and unionists had both to be able to say they won. You know, that's the nature of things like this. And so, unless you're going to get total defeat, which is not going to happen, clearly on either side, it has to be a compromise. And it'll be a compromise which involves people having to shake hands with a man that they were going to have in a kind of a Nuremberg trial that was 6 months ago. You know, I think that's the reality. I also fear that if somebody else took over from Putin, the person could be worse. You know, so because he has at least a degree of he has to preserve his own self-interest. You know, and let me go back again. This all goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the priority that was given then to establishing a capitalist market economy in Russia and the rest of Eastern Europe. The great benefit for the countries of Eastern Europe, Poland and all those, was that they drifted toward the European Union, and therefore there was a framework in which they had to from the beginning accept that they were going to be part of liberal democracies. They're not very liberal, they're far from perfect, but nevertheless, they are tied in. Russia was left out there on its own. They didn't worry about institutions, and they watched as Putin gradually took power, and because he was allowing big business to make a lot of money, and because things were grand, and because he was selling cheap gas all over Western Europe, we ignored what he was doing. You know, and I think we won't get rid of them now. So we will have to deal with them. You know, we've probably dealt with worse people, you know, in history. You know. So the answer to your question is I don't know.
Any more answers to say?
5 minutes.
Hardly a cause for celebration, though. Yes.
No. And it is a huge, for me, a huge moral dilemma. I don't believe the Second World War ended up being a just war, but it didn't start as a just war. The pretense that it was fought about the Hitler's tyranny is a rewriting of history. The Second World War was fought because Hitler threatened the balance of power, and it turned out then that he was a monster. But they would have quite happily accepted him as a monster. And in fact, there were many things he was saying that would have been quite popular in the United Kingdom at the time, and in England, or in America. But I believe very few wars that I've read about were just. There was always somebody powerful advancing a powerful cause, and usually on both sides. But the one in Ukraine, it's hard not to see it as a just war. If you're living next door and they suddenly invade, what do you do? I mean, St. Francis of Assisi would have said, turn the other cheek, yeah. But, yeah, you know, we did sometimes, you know. But, you know, it takes, back to you again, a great act of faith to do that, you know.
Yeah, and have began a sort of distance, yeah.
Well, I always believe that nobody can get to your heart, only God. I mean, they might get to your mind, but they're not necessarily to your heart.
Was it Eric Fromm or one of the people who wrote so well about the experience of being in the death camps said that the one thing they could never, they could do everything to you, but they could never control how you reacted to what they did to you.
Yeah.
What was his name?
Victor.
Victor Frankl, of course, yeah, sorry. Yeah.